Chapter 1. Mabel Blackwood's cottage sat at the edge of Millbrook, where the paved road surrendered to gravel and then to dirt. It was a calculated distance, close enough to town for occasional visitors, yet far enough that unannounced guests required deliberate attention. The white clapboard house with far-screened shutters had stood for over a century, passed down through the women of her family, though few in town knew much about Mabel's ancestry beyond whispers of old country ways and their uncanny green thumbs. The cottage itself was unremarkable, but the garden that surrounded it was extraordinary. From the road, one could glimpse an explosion of color and texture that seemed to defy the local growing conditions. Vegetables grew in perfect rows, herbs flourished in geometric patterns, and flowers bloomed, seemingly out of season. The garden was Mabel's masterpiece, her life's work, contained within the careful confines of an ancient stone wall that encompassed precisely 1 acre of land. On this particular spring morning, Mabel knelt in the soft earth, her silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in a loose braid. At 58, her hands showed the weathering of decades of gardening, strong, nimble, and marked with the elegant scars that came from intimacy with thorns and knives. She hummed softly to herself, an old folk tune whose words she'd long forgotten, as she harvested young dandelion greens for her afternoon salad. "Good morning, Miss Blackwood." The voice came from the garden gate, where Millbrook's mail carrier, Gary, stood with a small package in hand. He never entered without permission, though Mabel had told him countless times he was welcome. Perhaps some instinct kept him at the threshold. "Good morning, Gary," Mabel replied, rising with fluid grace that bellied her age. "Please, come in. I've just put the kettle on." Gary hesitated, as he always did, before stepping through the iron gate. "I shouldn't stay, ma'am. Route to finish and all." "Nonsense. I've made lemon balm tea with honey from my own hives," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. 5 minutes of your day is hardly a sacrifice." The young man's resolve weakened, as it always did. Mabel's teas were famous throughout the county, after all. "Well, just a quick cup, then." Mabel smiled, leading him through the garden's central path. To their left stretched what townspeople called her kitchen garden, neat rows of vegetables and aromatic herbs that supplied her table and the small farmer's market stall she maintained on summer Saturdays. To their right lay what she privately thought of as her other pharmacy, plants with less culinary but equally important purposes, though few in town understood their true significance. "Your garden is looking particularly vibrant this year," Gary remarked, unconsciously staying centered on the path, never straying toward either side. "The earth gives what we ask of it," Mabel replied, "if we know how to listen." Inside the cottage, copper pots hung from ceiling beams, and bundles of drying herbs scented the air with complex fragrances. Jars of preserved vegetables and fruits lined open shelves, their contents catching the morning light in jewel-toned splendor. Mabel gestured for Gary to sit at the small oak table as she prepared 2 delicate porcelain cups. "How is your mother's arthritis?" she asked, selecting a small jar of golden honey. Gary looked surprised. "Better, actually. Those tea bags you sent over last month have worked wonders. Dr. Reynolds is amazed." Mabel nodded, unsurprised. "Meadowsweet and willow bark. Older than any medicine in his cabinet." She set the steaming cup before him. "This is just lemon balm and honey, for joy and calm." As Gary sipped his tea, Mabel retrieved a small burlap sack from a cabinet. "Take this to your mother as well. Comfrey salve for her hands." "Miss Blackwood, you're too generous. Please, let me pay you." She waved away his offer. The garden provides abundantly. It would be selfish to hoard its gifts. This was how Mabel operated in Millbrook. The eccentric but benevolent herbalist, the keeper of old knowledge, the woman who could coax plants to grow where they shouldn't and cure ailments that modern medicine struggled with. It was a carefully cultivated image, true in its essentials, but incomplete. After Gary departed, Mabel returned to her garden, this time to the western section. Here, among innocent-looking greenery, grew her more specialized plants. Foxglove with its trumpet-shaped blooms, monkshood with its deep purple flowers, and delicate white hemlock that resemble Queen Anne's lace to the untrained eye. Intermingled were more benign but powerful plants, valerian for sleep, wormwood for visions, mandrake for pain. Mabel tended them all with equal care, equal reverence. 3 evenings a month, by invitation only, Mabel hosted dinner parties at her cottage. The guest list was always small, 3 or 4 people at most, and the food was legendary. Word had spread about these gatherings, and despite their infrequency, they had become one of the most coveted social invitations in Millbrook and beyond. People spoke of flavors they'd never experienced before, of dishes that seemed to unlock memories, and of wine that elevated moods beyond mere intoxication. What no one discussed, because no one had connected the pattern, was that occasionally, very occasionally, a guest at one of these dinners would pass away within a day or 2 afterward. Always peacefully, always seemingly from natural causes. An elderly gentleman with a weak heart, a middle-aged woman with an undiagnosed aneurysm, a young man with a rare congenital condition no one had detected. Mabel never chose these people. They chose themselves. She firmly believed this. Something guided them to her garden. Something made them speak the words or exhibit the behaviors that signaled their unconscious desire for release. Mabel considered herself merely the instrument of fate, providing a gentle transition from this world to the next through the ancient art of plants and their properties. Today, as she carefully harvested leaves from a particularly robust belladonna plant, Mabel thought about tomorrow night's dinner party. 4 guests were coming: the new high school principal and his wife, a retired judge who had recently moved to town, and Margaret Winters, a local real estate agent who had been pushing development projects that threatened the town's remaining green spaces. Margaret had visited Mabel's garden the previous week, ostensibly to discuss whether she might be interested in selling her property. While walking the grounds, Margaret had casually mentioned that she was dying to try Mabel's famous cooking. Then, standing directly behind the hemlock, she had remarked how exhausted she felt with life's constant battles, how sometimes she wished she could just go to sleep and not wake up to all the problems. Mabel had merely nodded and extended a dinner invitation. Margaret had accepted eagerly. Now, as the sun climbed higher, Mabel continued her work, harvesting both life-giving and life-taking plants with the same gentle hands, the same murmured words of gratitude. The garden was in full bloom, vibrant and potent, ready to serve whatever purpose was required of it. Mabel saw no contradiction in this duality. In her view, both sides of her garden, the nurturing and the deadly, were equally necessary, equally sacred. She would prepare a special tea for Margaret tomorrow, something with chamomile for its pleasant flavor and calming effects, a touch of lavender for its aroma, and just the right amount of foxglove to ensure peaceful heart failure in her sleep after the dinner. Margaret would never taste it beneath the honey and the other herbs. She would return home, fall asleep easily, and simply not wake up. The coroner would find nothing suspicious. People rarely investigated the deaths of those who appeared to die peacefully in their sleep, especially when they had made remarks about being tired of life. Mabel wasn't a murderer. She was a gardener, tending to the full cycle of existence. Her garden fed the living and eased the passing of those ready to depart, whether they consciously knew it or not. This was her calling, her family's legacy, her service to the natural order of things. As the noon bell rang from the distant church in town, Mabel gathered her harvest basket and headed back to the cottage. There were meals to prepare, teas to blend, and a special dinner to plan. The garden had provided, as it always did, exactly what was needed. Chapter 2. Mabel's garden was not a haphazard collection of plants, but a carefully designed sanctuary that reflected her understanding of balance and duality. From above, it resembled a perfect circle bisected by a straight flagstone path running north to south, creating two equal half-moons. Those who understood sacred geometry might recognize the ancient symbol of division between worlds. The eastern half, bathed in morning light, was what visitors saw when entering through the wrought iron gate. Here grew the culinary and medicinal herbs that Mabel was known for throughout the county. Raised beds of rich black soil hosted neat rows of vegetables, heirloom tomatoes with their uneven shapes and vibrant colors, purple-streaked dragon-tongue beans climbing trellises, and lettuce in shades from pale green to deep burgundy. Stone-lined circular beds held culinary herbs organized by family and use. The mint family with peppermint, spearmint, and lemon balm, the Mediterranean section with rosemary, thyme, sage, and oregano standing tall and fragrant in the sun, and the tea garden with chamomile, lemon verbena, and various varieties of lavender, releasing their soothing scents with each breeze. The plants here were abundant and generous, practically begging to be touched and smelled. Children from town who visited with their parents were allowed to nibble on the leaves of lemon balm or the petals of the nasturtiums that bordered the vegetable beds. Mabel would kneel beside them, teaching them to identify plants by leaf shape and scent before taste, a crucial lesson she emphasized repeatedly. "Always know what you're putting in your mouth," she would say, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Nature offers gifts, but demands respect." The western half of the garden was equally beautiful but subtly different. Those with keen observation might notice that the plants here grew slightly more wild, with a certain untamed quality despite their obvious careful cultivation. Mabel rarely invited visitors to this section, explaining it contained experimental varieties or plants sensitive to handling. If anyone did walk these paths with her, she moved with deliberate care, occasionally steering them gently by the elbow away from certain areas. Here grew her deadly harvest: foxglove with its beautiful speckled trumpet flowers that contain digitalis capable of stopping a heart, water hemlock nestled near the small ornamental pond, its white umbrella-shaped flower heads resembling innocent Queen Anne's lace, monkshood with its deep purple hooded blooms that could cause paralysis within hours, and deadly nightshade with berries that looked temptingly sweet but contained fatal levels of atropine. Interspersed among these were the benign lookalikes: garden flax near the foxglove, true Queen Anne's lace beside the hemlock, delphinium alongside monkshood. To the untrained eye, the distinctions were nearly invisible, and that was precisely the point. Mabel understood that nature's most dangerous creations often mimicked its most harmless ones. In the center of this western section stood a sundial of dark stone, its face engraved with symbols rather than numbers. Around it grew a circle of wormwood, its silvery gray foliage creating a ghostly halo when moonlight fell upon the garden. This was where Mabel often sat during the dark hours, communing with what she called the green wisdom, knowledge passed down through generations of her family's women, herbalists who understood both healing and harm. The periphery of the entire garden was enclosed by the ancient stone wall, predating the cottage itself. Climbing roses covered much of it, their thorns deceptively sharp beneath delicate blossoms. Between the wall and the planted areas ran a narrow path of crushed white shells that crunched underfoot, making it impossible for anyone to approach unheard, a security measure disguised as decoration. Near the northwestern corner stood Mabel's greenhouse, a Victorian structure of iron and glass where she nurtured seedlings in spring and overwintered tender plants. Its shelves held hundreds of labeled glass jars containing seeds collected over decades. Some were common varieties, others were rare heirlooms passed down through her family line, including several that existed nowhere else. The greenhouse was always locked with a key Mabel wore around her neck on a silver chain. A small shed adjacent to the greenhouse housed her tools, all meticulously cleaned and organized. Different pruning shears were designated for different sections of the garden, and she never crossed their use. The tools for the western garden were stored separately in a locked cabinet within the shed. Between the eastern and western sections, the central pathway widened to accommodate a wrought iron table and chairs, painted white, partially shaded by a pergola covered in climbing jasmine. This neutral territory was where Mabel often served afternoon tea to visitors, allowing them to enjoy the beauty of both halves of the garden while keeping them safely in the middle ground. The true genius of Mabel's garden was its seamless integration of death and life. Many deadly plants had legitimate culinary or medicinal uses in minute quantities. Mabel's expertise lay in knowing exactly how much could heal and how much could harm, a delicate calculation that required perfect measurement and intimate knowledge of each plant's potency, which varied with seasons, growing conditions, and harvest times. From certain plants in her western garden, Mabel could extract compounds that in minuscule doses created euphoria, reduced pain, or induced vivid dreams. In larger doses, these same compounds could cause paralysis, respiratory failure, or cardiac arrest. The line between medicine and poison was measured in drops and grains, and Mabel's hand never wavered when preparing either. As dusk fell across the garden on this particular evening, Mabel moved through her domain, checking plants that might need attention before tomorrow's gathering. The full moon would rise tonight, the perfect time to harvest certain flowers that release their essential oils most abundantly under lunar light. She paused at the foxglove, its tall spires of blooms nodding in the evening breeze. With gloved hands, she carefully selected several perfect specimens, placing them in a special basket kept separate from her culinary harvest. These would be dried in her attic, away from sunlight, then processed for their cardiac glycosides, compounds that in proper doses could treat heart failure, but in slightly higher amounts could cause it. "Just what I need for Margaret," she whispered to the plants, her fingers gentle on their stems. "A kindness, really. She's been unhappy for so long." The garden seemed to whisper back as twilight deepened, the sounds of leaves rustling in agreement with her assessment. Mabel had long ago stopped questioning whether these communications were real or imagined. The distinction hardly mattered when the results spoke for themselves. Tomorrow's dinner would feature dishes from both sides of her garden, nourishing, delicious food for 3 of her guests, and for Margaret, the same delectable cuisine, but with additions harvested from the western beds. Mabel felt no guilt about this. Margaret had asked for release without knowing she was asking. The garden had heard, and Mabel was merely its instrument. As the last light faded from the sky, Mabel gathered her harvest baskets and made one final check of the irrigation system. The stone wall surrounding her garden held more than just plants. It contained an entire philosophy of life and death, of giving and taking, of growth and decay. Within these boundaries, Mabel was goddess and servant both, cultivation and culprit, nurturer and reaper. She closed the greenhouse door and locked it, then made her way back to the cottage, her tall figure silhouetted against the rising moon. Tomorrow would be a day of preparation, of careful cooking, and setting the stage for what she had come to think of as a sacrament, a final meal that will honor both the bounty of the earth and the release of a soul ready to return to it. Chapter 3. Inside her cottage, Mabel lit candles instead of turning on electric lights. The soft, warm glow better suited her evening rituals, and she preferred to ease into darkness gradually as nature intended. She set a cast-iron kettle on the wood stove and settled into the worn leather chair that had belonged to her grandmother, Vivian Blackwood, whose portrait hung above the mantelpiece. In the flickering candlelight, the painted eyes seemed to follow Mabel with knowing approval. As she waited for the water to boil, Mabel opened a leather-bound journal, one of dozens that lined a bookshelf near her desk. Each contained meticulous records of her garden, her recipes, and her dinner guests. Some journals dated back generations, written in hands not her own, passed down along with the cottage and its secrets. She turned to a fresh page and began to write about the day's harvest and her plans for tomorrow's meal. Mabel had never explicitly articulated her philosophy to anyone living. How could she? The townspeople of Millbrook saw her as eccentric, but ultimately benevolent, an herbal healer with old-fashioned ways. They would never understand the fuller truth of her work, the sacred responsibility she carried. Only here, in her private journals, did she allow herself complete honesty about her calling. "It is not murder," she wrote in her elegant slanting script. "It is recognition. Recognition of a soul's readiness to depart, a body's desire to rest, a life completed, though perhaps not in years, but in purpose." Mabel firmly believed that people came to her garden when they were meant to. Not everyone who visited received a deadly dinner invitation. In fact, most enjoyed only the bounty of her eastern garden, the healing teas and nourishing vegetables. But occasionally, someone would wander in who carried what Mabel had come to recognize as the shadow of departure. She had first noticed it as a child, watching her grandmother tend to certain visitors with special care. Later, her grandmother explained what Mabel had intuitively sensed. Some people carried death within them already, not as disease necessarily, but as readiness, a completion. "They come to us because we can provide what they cannot ask for directly," Vivian had told her. "Listen closely, and they will tell you without words. Watch carefully, and they will show you without knowing. The garden calls to them, and they answer." Over decades of practice, Mabel had refined her ability to recognize these signals. Sometimes it was in the way a visitor lingered near the deadly plants, unconsciously drawn to what resonated with their inner state. Sometimes it was in casual words, spoken without awareness of their deeper meaning. Phrases like Margaret's about being tired of fighting or wishing to sleep. Sometimes it was simply a look in their eyes, a certain distance that suggested they were already halfway between worlds. Mabel never actively recruited these special guests. She never lured or manipulated. The very thought was abhorrent to her ethics, which were strict, though entirely her own. The guests had come to her garden of their own accord, had to speak the words or exhibit the behaviors that signaled their unconscious choice. Only then would Mabel extend a dinner invitation. "I am nature's instrument, not death's agent," she wrote in her journal. "I provide only what is already sought." The kettle began to whistle, and Mabel set down her pen to prepare her evening tea, a blend of chamomile, valerian, and passion flower that will help her sleep deeply before tomorrow's important work. As she steeped the herbs, she reflected on Margaret Winters, tomorrow's chosen guest. Margaret had come to Mabel's garden ostensibly to discuss the business proposition, buying the cottage and its land for a development project. But Mabel had seen immediately that something else had truly brought her there. Margaret moved through the garden with the distracted air of someone listening to distant music. When they passed the hemlock, Margaret had paused, touched its leaves with unexpected gentleness, and spoken about being tired of life's battles. Mabel had watched her carefully in that moment, noting how Margaret's shoulders had dropped, how her perpetually tense expression had momentarily softened into something like longing. Later, as they stood near the foxglove, Margaret had remarked on their beauty and then added, almost to herself, "I wonder what it feels like when a heart simply stops beating. So much quieter than all this noise we live with." Signs were unmistakable to Mabel's trained eye. Margaret was not actively suicidal. Mabel never selected such people, believing their distress was temporary and could be healed with proper care. No, Margaret belonged to that different category. Those who had completed their life's purpose, who had grown weary not from temporary depression, but from a deeper completion, a readiness to conclude. That Margaret was also threatening Mabel's garden with development plans was irrelevant. Mabel never selected guests based on personal grievances or practical concerns. Such motives would corrupt the sacred nature of her work, turn it from mercy to murder. She had declined dinner guests who showed the signs but whose deaths might benefit her in some way. The purity of purpose was essential. Sipping her tea by the fire, Mabel contemplated the nature of her calling. She had never married or had children, understanding early that her purpose required a certain solitariness. The Blackwood women rarely married. Their duty to the garden and its secrets typically precluded conventional family life. Mabel had occasionally taken lovers over the decades, but none had been invited to stay. None had been shown the true nature of the Western garden. She believed herself to be part of an ancient tradition older than any organized religion, a tradition of women who understood plants and their powers, who stood at the threshold between life and death and helped others cross when the time came. In earlier centuries, such women had been called witches and worse. In modern times, they were merely eccentric, their deeper knowledge disguised as harmless herb lore. We've always existed, her grandmother had told her, at the edges of villages and forests and mountains, anywhere plants grow. We've been healers and midwives, easing both entry into this world and exit from it. The church took away our right to assist with death, made it a sin rather than a mercy. But some needs cannot be legislated away. Mabel finished her tea and closed her journal. Tomorrow would begin early, with fresh harvesting at dawn when certain plants held their peak potency. She needed rest to ensure her hands would be steady and her measurements precise. There was no room for error in her work, either the culinary aspects or the darker purpose behind them. As she prepared for bed, Mabel paused at her kitchen window, looking out at her garden silvered by moonlight. The plants seemed to sway lightly despite the still air, as though acknowledging her gaze. She felt a deep connection to every living thing within those stone walls, a bond formed through years of daily tending. The garden was an extension of herself, or perhaps she was an extension of it. The boundaries had blurred long ago. "Thank you," she whispered to the silent garden, "for your gifts, for your wisdom, for your purpose." Whether anyone else would understand her philosophy was immaterial. Mabel knew with bone-deep certainty that her garden had a purpose beyond beauty or nourishment. It was a place of transition, a sacred space where life and death intermingled as naturally as the roots of neighboring plants, and she was its faithful keeper, tending both sides with equal care, equal reverence, equal love. Mabel climbed the narrow stairs to her bedroom, her mind already turning to tomorrow's preparations. She would need to rise before dawn to harvest 3 fresh herbs for Margaret's specialty. The foxglove would be combined with other plants to mask its bitter taste and dangerous properties. The meal would need to be exceptional in every way, a celebration of life, even as it ushered in death. As she drifted toward sleep, Mabel felt deeply at peace with her role in the natural order. She was neither good nor evil in conventional terms. She was simply necessary, like the predator that calls the weak from a herd, like the winter frost that allows for spring renewal. She provided an ending that was gentle and beautiful, a final moment of pleasure before eternal rest. It was, she believed, the greatest kindness she could offer to those who unconsciously sought it. And tomorrow, Margaret Winters would receive this gift, wrapped in the flavors of Mabel's extraordinary garden. Chapter 4. Mabel woke before dawn, her internal clock as reliable as any alarm. The cottage was cool and silent, the world outside still wrapped in darkness. She dressed methodically in a long cotton dress and sturdy gardening boots, then covered both with a heavy canvas apron with multiple pockets. Her tools, different sets for different plants, waited on the kitchen table where she laid them out the night before. Rather than breakfast, she drank only water from her well. Today's work required clarity and focus. She would eat later, after the critical morning harvest was complete. Mabel plaited her hair into a tight braid and wrapped a light shawl around her shoulders against the pre-dawn chill. Stepping outside, she breathed deeply. The air had that peculiar quality, unique to the moments before sunrise, heavy with dew and promise, carrying scents more clearly than at any other time. Mabel could smell each section of her garden distinctly. The sharp sweetness of ripening tomatoes, the complex perfume of the tea herbs, the subtle undertones of her more dangerous plants, detectable only to those who knew what to sense. She moved directly to the western garden, carrying a small wicker basket lined with dark cloth. The early morning collection was the first step in her careful process. Certain plants needed to be harvested precisely at dawn for maximum potency. Mabel knew from generations of handed-down knowledge and her own experimentation exactly which compounds peaked at which times. Her first stop was the foxglove patch. With gloved hands, she carefully selected the second-year plants with fully formed flowers. Using small silver scissors reserved only for toxic plants, she snipped specific leaves, not the oldest at the bottom, nor the youngest at the top, but the middle leaves where the cardiac glycosides concentrated most potently. Each cut was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Mabel murmured quiet thanks to each plant as she harvested, acknowledging the exchange of energy. Next, she moved to a small patch of the lily of the valley, their white bell-shaped flowers luminous in the growing light. Their toxins worked similarly to foxglove, but with subtle differences that would complement her purpose. Again, she harvested with precise movements, taking only what she needed, no more. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the eastern horizon, Mabel completed her collection of deadly ingredients with several sprigs of monkshood and a small amount of white hellebore. Each plant went into a separate pocket in her apron to prevent cross-contamination at this stage. With her western garden harvest complete, Mabel shifted to the eastern side, now bathed in golden morning light. Here she collected with bare hands fresh basil, rosemary, thyme, and sage that will form the backbone of tonight's dishes: chamomile, lemon balm, and lavender for teas, edible flowers for garnishes. These filled a different, larger basket, their colors vibrant against the warm wicker. Back in her kitchen, Mabel laid out her harvest on specific workstations. The western plants went to a marble-top table in the corner away from food preparation areas. The culinary herbs and vegetables were arranged on her central island. Now began the second phase of her process: preparation and extraction. For the deadly plants, Mabel donned thin latex gloves beneath her traditional gardening gloves, a concession to modern safety that her grandmother would have scoffed at, but that Mabel considered prudent. She worked with scientific precision, measuring each leaf and flower before beginning the extraction process. The foxglove and lily of the valley leaves were finely chopped and placed in a small glass bowl. To this, she added grain alcohol from a bottle kept locked in a special cabinet. The alcohol would extract the cardiac glycosides efficiently and preserve them until needed. She sealed the bowl with beeswax-coated cloth and placed it in a dark cupboard. By evening, the tincture would be ready. For the monkshood, she prepared a different extraction, using a method detailed in one of her oldest family journals. The result would be a nearly tasteless powder that could be mixed into food without detection. The white hellebore required yet another approach: a slow heating in oil that would draw out its bitter compounds while muting its natural bitterness. Throughout these preparations, Mabel maintained complete focus. This was the most crucial and dangerous part of her process. A mistaken measurement or method could result in a preparation too weak to be effective or too strong to be controllable. Her family had developed these techniques over centuries, refining them through careful observation and recording. Mabel had added her own improvements based on modern understanding of plant chemistry, creating a hybrid methodology that combined ancient wisdom with scientific precision. Once the deadly preparations were complete and safely stored, Mabel thoroughly cleaned her western workstation, washing her tools in a special solution that neutralized any remaining toxins before stirring them separately from her kitchen implements. She changed her apron and washed her hands in a ritual that went beyond mere cleanliness. It was a symbolic transition between her dual roles. Now she could turn her attention to the conventional cooking preparations. Mabel was as meticulous with her culinary work as with her poisons, perhaps even more so. The meals she served as her dinner parties had earned her local fame, and she took genuine pride in her cooking. Today's menu had been planned carefully to complement the season and showcase her garden's bounty. The appetizer would be chilled cucumber soup with yogurt and dill, garnished with edible flowers. The main course, herb-crusted rack of lamb with roasted root vegetables and a reduction sauce infused with rosemary and blackberries. Dessert would be lavender honey panna cotta with fresh berries, and finally, a selection of herbal teas tailored to each guest's preferences. It was in the tea where Mabel would deliver Margaret's special ingredients. Tea was ideal. Its natural bitterness could mask other flavors, and people expected it to have immediate effects on their body and mood. Margaret would receive a blend of chamomile and lavender for its calming aroma and flavor, along with leaves of lemon balm for taste. Hidden within would be precise amounts of her foxglove and lily of the valley extractions, calibrated to cause cardiac arrest approximately 6 hours after consumption, long after Margaret had returned home from the dinner party. The delay was intentional and carefully calculated. Mabel never wanted deaths to occur in her home or be immediately connected to her meals. The cardiac glycosides would work gradually, making Margaret increasingly drowsy and relaxed. She would likely go to bed feeling pleasantly tired and simply not wake up. The official cause will almost certainly be determined as natural heart failure, particularly since Margaret was in her early 60s and had mentioned high blood pressure during their garden conversation. As afternoon approached, Mabel prepared the dining room, setting her grandmother's finest china and crystal on the oak table. She selected fresh flowers from the garden for a centerpiece. Nothing from the western side, of course. Each place setting included a small handwritten menu and a tiny pot of living herbs as a gift for guests to take home. Margaret's contained only culinary varieties. Mabel never sent anyone home with potentially dangerous plants. 4 hours before guests were due to arrive, Mabel began final food preparations. She moved with practiced efficiency, timing each dish perfectly. The lamb would rest while guests enjoyed their appetizers. The panna cotta had been made the previous day and waited in the refrigerator. Garden vegetables were washed and prepped, ready for the last-minute cooking to preserve their freshness. With the conventional food underway, Mabel returned to her western preparations. She carefully measured drops of the foxglove and lily of the valley tinctures into small brown glass vial, then added the monkshot powder. This concentrated mixture would later be added to Margaret's tea service and would contain precisely the right dosage, enough to be effective but not so much that it would cause suspicious symptoms at the table. Each step in Mabel's process reflected decades of refinement. She had learned, through careful observation, how to identify those unconsciously seeking release. She had perfected methods of extraction that preserved potency while eliminating detectability. She had developed serving techniques that ensured only the intended recipient received the deadly dose. Perhaps most importantly, she had cultivated a reputation that made her dinner invitations coveted rather than suspicious. People felt honored to dine at Mabel's table, to experience her legendary cooking and hospitality. They would never connect her meals with the occasional peaceful passing of a guest days later. As evening approached, Mabel changed into a simple but elegant dress of deep green linen. She arranged her silver hair in a loose knot and added only a single piece of jewelry, a pendant of polished moonstone that had belonged to her mother. Looking in the mirror, she saw not a killer, but a priestess preparing for a sacred rite, a gardener tending to the full cycle of life and death. The sun began to set over her garden, casting long shadows across the carefully tended beds. In less than an hour, guests would arrive. Margaret Winters would enjoy her final dinner, a celebration of flavor and fellowship, before her quiet release from life's burdens. Mabel felt only serenity as she put in finishing touches on her table settings and lit candles throughout the cottage. This was her calling, her art, her service, a process honed to perfection through generations of careful practice and observation. Tonight, it would unfold once more, as natural and inevitable as the blooming and withering of the plants in her remarkable garden. Chapter 5. At precisely 7 o'clock, the first knock came at Mabel's door. She opened it to find Robert and Susan Chin, the new high school principal, and his wife, standing on her porch with a bottle of wine. Robert was tall and lean with wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance. Susan, shorter and more animated, immediately complimented the scent of herbs that wafted from the cottage. "Mabel, this is such a treat," Susan said, handing over the wine. "We've heard so much about your dinners since moving to Millbrook." "All good things, I hope," Mabel replied with a warm smile, accepting the bottle, a decent Cabernet that would pair nicely with the lamb. "Please, come in. You're the first to arrive." She led them through the cottage into the dining room, where candles already burned in silver holders. The table was set with antique china, and crystal that caught and multiplied the candlelight. Fresh flowers from the eastern garden formed a low centerpiece that wouldn't impede conversation across the table. "What a beautiful home," Robert remarked, looking around at the herb bundles hanging from the ceiling beams and the collection of botanical prints on the wall. "Very different from our modern box in the new development." "This cottage has been in my family for generations," Mabel explained. "I'm afraid I've never been tempted by contemporary architecture." A faint shadow crossed Susan's face. "Speaking of developments, isn't Margaret Winters joining us tonight? I heard she's been trying to buy property in this area for that new housing project." "Yes, Margaret will be here," Mabel confirmed, keeping her tone neutral. "Along with Judge Franklin, who recently moved to town. Would you care for a drink while we wait for the others?" She served them her homemade elderflower cordial mixed with sparkling water, a refreshing aperitif that would stimulate the appetite without dulling the palate. As they sipped, Mabel gave them a brief tour of the sitting room and its collection of botanical books dating back to the 19th century. She was explaining the different methods of plant preservation illustrated in one volume when another knock announced the arrival of Judge Walter Franklin. The retired judge was in his 70s, with a full head of white hair and the erect posture of a man accustomed to commanding respect. He had moved to Millbrook 6 months earlier after the death of his wife, seeking the quieter pace of small-town life after decades on the federal bench in Boston. "Miss Blackwood," he said formally, bowing slightly as she welcomed him. "Thank you for the invitation. I've been looking forward to this evening since you extended it at the library fundraiser." Mabel introduced him to the Chins, and conversation flowed easily as they discussed the judge's transition to Millbrook and Robert's plans for the high school's curriculum. Mabel excused herself briefly to check on the kitchen, where everything was proceeding exactly as scheduled. The soup was chilling, the lamb was resting at the perfect temperature, and the tea service was prepared, including the special blend for Margaret, its small brown vial hidden behind a canister of regular chamomile. The final knock came at 7:20, Margaret Winters arriving fashionably late as Mabel had anticipated. The real estate developer was a striking woman in her early 60s with expertly colored blonde hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting her way. She wore an expensive linen dress and carried a small hostess gift wrapped in silver paper. "Mabel, darling," Margaret said, air-kissing near Mabel's cheek. "So sorry I'm not perfectly punctual. A client call ran long." "Not at all," Mabel assured her. "We've only just started drinks. Please, join us." Margaret handed her the small package. "Just a token of appreciation. French lavender soap. I remember you mentioning your fondness for lavender during our garden tour." "How thoughtful," Mabel said, genuinely pleased by the appropriateness of the gift. Margaret had been paying attention during their walk, even as she contemplated destroying the garden for her development. This complexity made Mabel appreciate her even more as a chosen guest. With everyone arrived, Mabel guided them to the dining table. She had arranged the seating carefully. Margaret at her right hand, where she could easily manage the specialty service, Judge Franklin at her left, and the Chins across from them. The elderflower cordial had loosened their initial formality, and conversation flowed as Mabel brought out the first course. "Chilled cucumber soup with yogurt, dill, and edible flowers from my garden," she announced, placing the delicate bowls before each guest. "The purple flowers are violets, which add a subtle sweetness. The yellow are calendula, perfectly edible and rich in antioxidants." The guests exclaimed over the presentation. The pale green soup, dotted with vibrant flower petals, created a visual display as appealing as its flavor. Mabel took quiet satisfaction in their appreciation. Even tonight's special perk didn't diminish her pride in her culinary skills. As they enjoyed the soup, Margaret brought up her development project, seemingly unable to resist discussing business even at a social gathering. "Mabel, I hope you've given more thought to my offer," she said between spoonfuls. "Blackwood Estates has such a nice ring to it, don't you think? We could design the community around your garden, make it a centerpiece." While preserving only a fraction of it, Mabel noted mildly, "I'm afraid my answer remains the same, Margaret. This land has been in my family too long to part with it." Judge Franklin nodded approvingly. "Family legacy matters. My wife and I lived in the same Boston brownstone for 40 years. Couldn't bear to sell it after she passed, though my children thought I should." "Where is it now?" Susan Chin asked. Still mine, the judge said with a slight smile. I rented out to a law professor from Harvard. Couldn't sever the connection entirely. Margaret looked frustrated, but quickly mastered. Of course, I understand attachment to property. It's just that this location is ideal for what the town needs. Newer housing options for professionals moving into the area. The old properties simply don't offer the amenities people expect these days. Mabel noticed how Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she set down her soup spoon. Not from emotion, she suspected, but from the mild hypertension Margaret had mentioned during their garden tour. Another sign that her heart was already compromised, which would make tonight's special tea all the more effective and less likely to raise suspicions. As Mabel cleared the soup course, she observed her guests with practiced attention. Their chins were clearly enjoying themselves, relaxed and appreciative. Judge Franklin maintained a certain formality but seemed genuinely engaged, particularly when the conversation turned to local history. And Margaret showed the subtle signs Mabel had come to recognize over decades of hosting similar guests. A certain distracted quality to her gaze, occasional remarks that hinted at weariness with life's burdens, and a tendency to look out the windows toward the darkened garden with unusual frequency. The main course drew appreciative murmurs from everyone. The herb-crusted back of the lamb was perfectly cooked, pink in the center and fragrant with rosemary and thyme. The roasted root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, and golden beets from Mabel's garden had caramelized edges and were drizzled with the blackberry reduction sauce. "This is extraordinary," Judge Franklin declared after his first bite. "Miss Blackwood, you could have had a career as a chef in the finest restaurants." "Mabel prefers to keep her talents for an appreciative few," Margaret said with unusual perception. "Not everyone deserves to experience something this special. Isn't that right, Mabel?" Mabel met her gaze steadily. "I believe some experiences are meant to be rare rather than common. Mass production tends to diminish quality. Like housing developments," the judge added with a wry smile, causing Margaret to flush slightly. Throughout the main course, Mabel kept the wine flowing and the conversation moving, a skilled hostess guiding the social interactions while observing each guest closely. The Chins shared stories about their previous posting at a private school in Vermont. Judge Franklin spoke eloquently about his most memorable cases without revealing confidential details. Margaret talked about her rise through the real estate world, emphasizing the barriers she'd overcome as a woman in a male-dominated field. "It's been a constant battle," she admitted, her voice taking on the wistful quality Mabel had noted in the garden. "Sometimes I wonder if it was worth all the fight. What legacy am I really leaving? More cookie-cutter houses on land that used to grow things?" "Your developments provide homes for families," Susan Chin offered kindly. Margaret nodded absently. "Yes, but at what cost? When I walk through Mabel's garden, I feel something I never feel in my new constructions, a sense of permanence, of connection to something larger than commerce." Mabel recognized the moment for what it was, confirmation that Margaret had indeed been unconsciously seeking what tonight's dinner would provide. The woman was questioning her life's work, feeling its fundamental emptiness. She was ready for release, even if she didn't consciously know it. After the main course, Mabel served her lavender honey panna cotta, a delicate dessert that cleansed the palate and prepared the way for the final, most important course, the tea service. The conversation had grown more philosophical, touching on questions of purpose and meaning. Margaret had grown quieter, contributing less, but listening more intently. "And now, to complete our meal, I've prepared tea selections for each of you," Mabel announced, bringing in a tray with 4 distinctive ceramic cups. "I tried to match the blend to the individual, a little intuition mixed with herbalism." She placed a cup before Robert Chin. "For you, a stimulating blend of peppermint and ginger to energize the mind, suited for an educator with new ideas." Next was Susan's cup, rooibos with vanilla and cinnamon, warm, nurturing flavors for someone who clearly cares deeply about students. The judge received a cup of Earl Grey mixed with lavender, traditional with just a touch of the unexpected, like your judicial philosophy from what I've gathered, Judge Franklin. Finally, she placed Margaret's special cup before her, a handmade ceramic piece in subtle blues and greens. "For you, Margaret, chamomile and lemon balm with lavender to soothe the spirit and ease the mind. You mentioned feeling tired of battles. This should provide some peace." Margaret lifted the cup, inhaling the fragrant steam. "It smells divine. You truly have a gift, Mabel." She took a sip and smiled. "I can almost feel the tension leaving my body already." "Herbs work quickly when properly prepared," Mabel said, pouring hot water into her own cup of simple peppermint tea. "The body recognizes what it needs." As the evening wound down, the guests lingered over their tea, conversation growing more intimate as trust and warmth filled the room. Even Margaret and Judge Franklin, who had initially seemed at odds over the development issue, found common ground discussing the challenges of professional life and the search for meaning in later years. "I sometimes think I should have spent more time cultivating a garden like yours," Margaret told Mabel as she finished her tea. "Creating something living instead of just structures." "It's never too late to begin," Mabel replied, though she knew that for Margaret, it was indeed too late. The cardiac glycosides were already in her system, beginning their silent work that will culminate in the early morning hours. By 10 o'clock, the guests were preparing to leave, expressing their thanks and admiration for the exceptional meal. The Chins were the first to depart, followed by Judge Franklin, who bowed formally over Mabel's hand in an old-fashioned gesture of appreciation. Margaret was the last to leave, lingering at the door as though reluctant to return to her empty modern house on the other side of town. "Thank you, Mabel. I can't remember when I've enjoyed an evening more. I feel at peace somehow." "I'm glad," Mabel said sincerely, clasping Margaret's hand briefly. "Drive safely and sleep well." "I'm sure I will," Margaret replied with a drowsy smile. "That tea was exactly what I needed. I feel like I could sleep for days." Mabel watched as Margaret walked to her car, noting the slight unsteadiness that could be attributed to the wine, but was more likely the first effects of the foxglove. Nothing alarming or immediate, just a gentle relaxation, a slowing of the system that would progress gradually throughout the night. After closing the door, Mabel began clearing the table with methodical care. She washed Margaret's teacups separately, ensuring all traces of the special blend were removed. The evening had gone perfectly. The meal enjoyed, the conversation engaging, and Margaret's unconscious signals confirming that Mabel had correctly identified her readiness. As she finished cleaning up, Mabel felt the familiar sense of completion that followed these special dinner parties. There was no guilt, no distress, only the quiet certainty that she had fulfilled her purpose, honoring both her garden's bounty and its deeper power. Tomorrow morning, she would harvest fresh herbs for drying, tend to her tomato plants that needed stalking, and replace a section of lavender that had grown woody with age. Life in the garden would continue its cycles of growth and decay, nurturing and culling, just as it had for generations under the care of Blackwood women. And sometimes, tomorrow, perhaps mid-morning, she would hear the distant sound of sirens heading towards Margaret's house, where a cleaning lady or concerned colleague would discover her body, peaceful in death as she had rarely been in life. Mabel went to bed that night with the serenity of someone who had performed a sacred duty with care and precision. Her last thought before drifting to sleep was of Margaret's face as she sipped the tea, the unexpected relaxation of deep lines, the momentary glimpse of relief that had crossed her features, as though on some level she understood and welcomed what was coming. Chapter 6. Morning arrived with gentle persistence. Sunlight filtering through Mabel's bedroom curtains in patterns that suggested it was already past 7, later than she typically rose. She had slept deeply, dreamlessly, as she always did after her special dinner parties. It was as though some part of her entered a restorative dormancy, mirroring the peaceful transition she had facilitated for her chosen guest. Mabel dressed in her gardening clothes and prepared a simple breakfast of toast with honey from her own hives and tea made from fresh mint. As she ate, she reviewed the previous evening with the clinical detachment of an artist assessing a completed work. The dinner had unfolded perfectly, the food exceptional, the conversation engaging, and most importantly, Margaret had consumed every drop of her specially prepared tea. By now, Mabel estimated, Margaret would have been gone for several hours. The cardiac glycosides would have reached peak concentration in her bloodstream sometime around 3 a.m., gradually slowing her heart until it simply stopped. She would not have awakened would not have felt pain or fear, just a deepening of sleep until sleep became something more permanent. Mabel washed her breakfast dishes and stepped outside into her garden. The morning was beautiful, the air fresh with the scent of dew-dampened earth and blooming flowers. She began her daily routine of checking each bed, noting which plants needed attention, which were ready for harvest. This methodical work helped ease the transition back to ordinary life after the intensity of the previous evening. At the far end of the garden, near the wall separating her property from the lane, Mabel spotted movement. A robin was building a nest in the climbing roses, carefully weaving twigs and grass into a cup-shaped home for its future offspring. Mabel paused to watch the bird's determined efforts, appreciating the constant cycles of creation that surrounded her. The distant wail of sirens penetrated the morning calm shortly after 9 o'clock. Mabel continued her work, deadheading spent blooms from her lavender plants with practiced snips of her pruning shears. The sound grew louder, then faded, as the emergency vehicles presumably reached their destination. Mabel knew exactly where they were going. By mid-afternoon, news had begun to spread through Millbrook's efficient grapevine. Mabel heard it first from Gary, the mail carrier, who appeared at her garden gate with a package and a somber expression. "Terrible news, Miss Blackwood," he said, handing her a small box of gardening supplies she'd ordered. "Margaret Winters was found dead this morning. Her assistant went to check on her when she didn't show up for an important meeting. Apparently, she died in her sleep." Mabel arranged her features in an expression of appropriate shock. "How dreadful. Was she ill?" "Not that anyone knew of," Gary replied. "Dr. Reynolds said it was likely her heart. Natural causes. Still, it's a shock. She seemed so vibrant, so forceful." "Yes," Mabel agreed quietly, "though appearances can be deceiving. Did you know her well?" Gary shook his head. "Just as a customer. She came by the post office regularly to send contracts and such. Always in a rush, that one. Never seemed to slow down." "Perhaps that was part of the problem," Mabel suggested gently. "The heart needs rest as much as exercise." After Gary left, Mabel returned to her kitchen and made a pot of chamomile tea, regular chamomile, with no special additions. She sipped it slowly, contemplating the news she had anticipated. Margaret's death would change the dynamics of Millbrook in ways that reached beyond Mabel's garden. The development project would likely stall without its driving force. The town council would need to reconsider zoning issues that Margaret had been pushing. New people would eventually fill the vacuum her absence created. Life would adjust, as it always did after death created space for new growth. Mabel found this thought comforting rather than morbid. By evening, Mabel had received 3 phone calls from acquaintances sharing the news and expressing their shock. Each conversation required her to feign surprise while offering thoughtful reflections on mortality and the unpredictability of life. The third call came from Susan Chin, still processing the fact that someone she dined with just hours earlier was now gone. "I can't believe it, Mabel," Susan said, her voice heavy with emotion. "We were just all together at your table. Margaret seemed fine, tired perhaps, but who isn't these days?" "It's a powerful reminder of life's fragility," Mabel replied, her voice gentle with genuine compassion. Susan's distress was real, and Mabel respected authentic grief. "The strangest thing is," Susan continued, "I keep thinking about something Margaret said just before we left. She mentioned feeling at peace for the first time in ages after your dinner. That she'd been fighting battles for so long and was tired of it all. It's almost as if she knew, somehow." "People often have intuitions about such things," Mabel said carefully. "The body has wisdom we don't fully understand." 3 days later, a small memorial service was held for Margaret at Millbrook's Community Center. Mabel attended, dressed in a subdued navy dress rather than black, which she felt would have been hypocritical given her role in Margaret's passing. She brought a simple arrangement of herbs and flowers from her garden, all from the eastern side, all representing peace and remembrance. The service was sparsely attended. Margaret, it seemed, had few close friends despite her prominence in local business circles. Her adult son flew in from Seattle, looking shell-shocked and slightly guilty. During the reception afterward, Mabel overheard him telling Judge Franklin that he and his mother had been estranged for years, that he'd been meaning to reconcile, but had always thought there would be time later. Mabel approached him with a cup of coffee as he stood alone near the refreshment table. "You must be Margaret's son," she said, offering the cup. "I'm Mabel Blackwood. Your mother dined at my home the evening before she passed." The young man, perhaps in his early 30s, accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "David Winters, thank you for coming. Did you know my mother well?" "Not well," Mabel admitted, "but we had meaningful conversations. She spoke about feeling tired of fighting all the time, about questioning whether her work had created the legacy she truly wanted." David's expression shifted from polite interest to surprise. "She said that? My mother never admitted doubt to anyone, least of all herself." "Perhaps that's why she could say it to me," Mabel suggested. "Sometimes it's easier to be honest with relative strangers than with those closest to us." "What else did she say?" he asked, a new intensity in his gaze. Mabel considered her words carefully. "She admired my garden, said she wished she created something living instead of just structures. I think she was reassessing her priorities, David. That's not uncommon as we age." The young man's eyes filled unexpectedly with tears. "I wish I'd known. I always thought she was completely satisfied with her choices, with putting career above everything else, including me." Mabel touched his arm lightly. "I believe she was finding her way toward a different understanding. Perhaps that's a kind of peace to hold on to." Later that week, Mabel learned through the local newspaper that Margaret's development company was being restructured, with new leadership taking the project in a different direction. The aggressive push to develop the outskirts of Millbrook, including the area around Mabel's cottage, was being reconsidered in favor of revitalizing existing properties in the town center. Life in Millbrook returned to its usual rhythms. Spring advanced into early summer, bringing new growth and activity to Mabel's garden. She hosted another dinner party 6 weeks after Margaret's death, this time with completely different guests and no special additions to anyone's tea. Not every gathering required death. Mabel's gift was in recognizing when it was needed, not enforcing it upon the unwilling. One morning in June, Mabel looked up from her reading to find David Winters standing at her garden gate. She rose, brushing soil from her hands, and invited him in. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," he said, looking around the garden with open wonder. "I'm finalizing my mother's affairs and remembered what you said about her admiring your garden. I wanted to see it for myself." Mabel guided him along the central path, explaining the layout and purpose of different sections, though only in terms he would understand. She spoke of culinary herbs and vegetables, of plants for teas and natural remedies. She did not mention the Western garden's deadlier purpose. "It's remarkable," David said as they completed the tour. "I can see why my mother was affected by it. There's something timeless here." They sat at the small table under the pergola, and Mabel served iced tea with mint and lemon balm, innocent herbs from the Eastern garden. David shared his plans to remain in Millbrook for a few more weeks, sorting through his mother's possessions and reconsidering the direction of her company. "I'm thinking of establishing a small community garden on some of the land she owned," he confided. "Something that honors what you said, her late-in-life wish to create something living." Mabel nodded approvingly. "That would be a fitting tribute, I think." As David prepared to leave, he paused at the garden gate. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about coincidence lately. How strange it is that my mother had dinner with you the night before she died, and that she spoke to you about doubts she'd never shared with anyone else. Almost as if she was meant to be here, to have that moment of clarity before the end." Mabel met his gaze steadily. "I believe we're often guided to the experiences we need, even if we don't consciously know what we're seeking." David nodded slowly. "That's oddly comforting. Thank you, Miss Blackwood." After he left, Mabel returned to her gardening, mulching her tomato plants with composted leaves from the previous fall. The garden thrived under her care, both the nurturing eastern half and the deadly western section. Both were necessary, both were part of the same whole. Death and life, ending and beginning, Mabel served them equally, with the same careful attention and respect. That evening, as she updated her journal with notes about the day's work, Mabel added a final reflection on Margaret Winters. "Her passing has created new possibilities, as death always does. Her son may find healing through the garden he plans to create. The town may develop in more sustainable ways. And I believe Margaret herself found the peace she was seeking, though she didn't know how to ask for it directly. The garden recognized her need and provided, as it always does for those who are truly ready. Mabel closed her journal and placed it on the shelf alongside dozens of others containing the accumulated wisdom and observations of Blackwood women across generations. Tomorrow will bring new growth, new visitors to her garden, perhaps new signals from someone unconsciously seeking release from life's burdens. And Mabel would be there, as she had always been, tending both sides of her remarkable garden with equal care, cultivating life with the same skilled hands that occasionally, when necessary, delivered death. Chapter 7. As summer unfolded, Mabel's garden flourished in vibrant abundance. The eastern beds produced record yields of vegetables and herbs, while the western section grew with equal vigor, beautiful, dangerous, and essential to Mabel's purpose. She continued her careful observation of visitors, noting their words and behaviors, ever attentive to those unconscious signals that might indicate readiness for her special brand of mercy. New faces appeared at her garden gate, a retired professor with trembling hands and distant eyes who lingered near the foxglove, murmuring about the tiresome wait. A young woman with terminal illness hidden beneath a cheerful facade who asked too many questions about peaceful ways to sleep. Mabel watched and listened, patient as the seasons themselves. In her greenhouse, seedlings for next year's garden were already taking root, both those that would nourish and those that would release. Mabel tended them all with equal care, equal reverence, equal love. The cycle would continue as it had for generations of Blackwood women before her. And in time, when Mabel herself grew weary, she would train a successor, perhaps a niece or distant cousin, or simply a young woman drawn to the garden's mysteries. Someone who understood instinctively that nature encompassed both growth and decay, that sometimes the greatest kindness was a gentle ending. Until then, Mabel would continue her sacred work, cultivating her extraordinary garden where life and death intertwined so seamlessly that visitors only saw beauty, never recognizing that half the garden was devoted to the gentle art of ending, unless, of course, they unconsciously sought precisely that. The garden would provide, as it always had, exactly what was needed.